Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll be starting shortly in our technology panel. I'm sure many of you are very eager to hear the latest innovation in quantifying forest outcomes. So I guess I'll start by giving the floor to our amazing panelists and give them a chance to introduce themselves. I'll start with Caleb.
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Caleb Midgley, Senior Product Manager with Descartes Labs. Descartes Labs was created with the goal of solving big geospatial problems, geospatial data problems. It came out of the national labs as far as some of the technology. And our idea is that, okay, let's take some great supercomputing power, some great PhD scientists, and let's solve some business problems in a way that is not being done because these technologies are a bit unique in their scalability, but they also have to be global scale problems. So I manage a portfolio of sustainability products that we have at Descartes Labs, involved with things such as deforestation, so that our customers can remain true to their commitment for deforestation-free supply chains, forest carbon estimation. We even do things in the agricultural space when it comes to crop productivity estimates and those types of things. So it's a pleasure to be here today. Thanks.
Murray?
Hello everybody, my name is Murray Collins. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Space Intelligence. I've been working in the field of satellite data analytics for forest conservation and restoration for the past 16 years. I know you won't believe that because I look so young, it's true. We've got a team of 10 PhDs in our team and 1 professor, all specialized in satellite data analytics for forestry, so we're absolutely laser focused on that. In terms of our heritage, amongst our senior team, we've got over 100 academic publications on how you measure forests from space using satellite data, and so we're just absolutely laser focused on this particular challenge of supporting nature-based solutions. So we work with fantastic projects around the world, including green gold forestry, which you heard about yesterday, but we're also increasingly working with large corporates who are investing in large portfolios of nature-based solutions projects to meet their own net zero commitments. So in that latter context, we'll systematically assess projects in a portfolio prior to investment and then provide long-term MRV to support transparency and impact assessment of those projects. So that's us.
Fantastic. Eve?
Hi everyone, I am Eve Boyce-Ratliff, and I work for a software development company called Upstream Tech that makes front-end products to help folks access the type of data that the rest of the panel is creating. So we got our start working in the land conservation space. One of our first customers was the Nature Conservancy, who were working on a project called Bird Returns, where they were flooding agricultural fields for bird habitats and then sending folks out in the field to monitor the depth of the water on those fields in person. And they thought there's got to be a more efficient way for us to do this using remote technologies, and so that was really sort of the starting point for us building out a platform with which to do that type of monitoring. We've since expanded to working with over 170 organizations, many of them still in the land conservation space, where they have that use case of they need to go out onto properties every year, they need to put eyes on the ground to make sure that the projects that they've invested in are still generating environmental returns, and they can do that using remotely sensed data as opposed to going out in the field. That same use case really applies to the forest carbon space as well, and so we've seen more and more interest from organizations that are replacing some or all of their time spent monitoring in the field using remotely sensed data, and we create the platform with which to do that. So we're not creating data ourselves, we're a front-end platform development company where we're pulling in data from some of the great companies like folks sitting up here today to give access and analytical tools to allow folks to really easily generate the insights that they need to make better project management decisions.
Awesome. Matt?
Hi, I'm Matt Tyburski. I'm founder of GSI. We've been around since 2013. Since our first IFM project, since this community is really focused on carbon, was around the 2015-2016 period. We then spent probably the next 5 years having a strong focus on IFM, working with project developers specifically in the US. Then we came to the realization that the same data that's used for project origination can also be used for land acquisitions. So we've then kind of diversified who we work with around 2021, 2022, and we've moved more into the TIMO REIT scenario, and then we also work with the timberland managers. We offer a statewide product in the US. The statewide product is basically a stratified inventory for every parcel in the state. We then work on projects where clients will put ground data into those parcels and basically dial it into specific locations. So I guess the utility of what our data provides at this TIMO REIT level, we help with species more in the north. In the south, we help with kind of competitive analysis with other operators in the same supply basin. At a timberland management level, we also provide enhanced forest inventory, but we are forest inventory focused.
Awesome. And my name is Raymond. I will be the moderator today. I came from RMI, Rocky Mountain Institute. It's a US-based climate energy think tank. My previous background involving tracking and participating and supporting the UNFCCC negotiations, specifically on Article 6. My work at RMI mainly is supporting organizations like ICVCM and other industry bodies, helping survey and benchmarking the remote sensing and digital MRV solutions that you are now seeing at this great panel, and trying to understand for ourselves, but also for the general public in the market, what can these technologies provide? And that's what we're gonna dig in today. And I guess the first question I would like to ask might be something that everyone in this room is interested in. So in the past few days, or in the past few weeks really, we've seen an increasing number of criticism on REP Plus and forestry carbon credits from large media outlets. I guess as technology providers in this space, I'd like to ask everyone on this panel, how would you respond to such criticism on forest carbon credits? And what can your technologies provide to increase the transparency and trust in these projects? I guess I'll start with Murray.
Okay, good stuff. Right, yeah, I think I've got multiple answers to this question, but I won't take too long. I mean, one is philosophical, so are we dealing with a perfect system? No. Is that a good basis for trashing the entire system and undermining one of the best possible opportunities that we have to tackle climate change, biodiversity loss, and support some of the world's poorest people? I think we're all here in this room because we know the answer to that. So I'm fundamentally opposed to those articles. On the scientific basis of the work that was done, we think that the data which was used to perform the analysis was fundamentally inappropriate to reach the conclusions which were summarized in those articles published by the Guardian newspaper. My co-founder, Ed Mitchard, who's a leading expert worldwide in use of satellite data to assess forest carbon projects, has summarized all of our thoughts in an article in Carbon Pulse, and I'm very, very happy to share that with everybody in the room, and that crystallizes the technological response and scientific response to the points which are raised in that. So fundamentally reject what was said in those articles. There are, I suppose we should say that there are bad projects out there, but the big picture is that these technologies, which we're all developing in our own particular ways, can shed new light on what's going on in practice, can provide the transparency and integrity that the market needs. So let's not nuke the whole thing. We're all in this place together because we believe in what we're doing, and the technologies can help provide the solutions to drive this whole market forwards.
Brilliant. Caleb?
Yeah, it's tough to follow, but here we go. No, the Guardian article itself is a bit misleading if you dive into the journal articles. And you look at, if you read those papers, And then you go back to the Guardian article, you're kind of like, wait, were they reading the same papers? Because one paper had a completely different outcome than the other two, and yet Guardian said they were all the same outcome, which was not accurate. Okay, that being said, unfortunately the bad news is out, and most people did not dive into those journal articles to figure out what was going on. So what do we do about that? I still think that there are places in the system that can be improved. I think it is our opportunity to truly sequester carbon as well as bring a lot of other co-benefits. But what's interesting about the whole paper is that it brought some concepts to the fore that I really think we should take a closer look at. Synthetic controls and using that for baselining. And if anything, just bringing a little bit of consistency to baselining altogether would be a good thing, right? So that we can have confidence in what's truly being done with these projects. And so the synthetic control or dynamic baselining concept, I think that's a great thing to come out of this, even though it came out in such a bad way. And then there's other aspects of how digital MRV providers can bring greater integrity into the future through this process by bringing more frequent data into these conversations. I think in a lot of ways the current project process relies on data that could be updated more frequently, and providers such as ourselves up here can bring that more frequent update to the equation. So yeah, it was a bad way for it to come out, but I think there's some truths in it that if we latch onto those, we could do a better job.
Awesome. Eve?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Caleb. I think setting aside the critiques in the Guardian article, in general, the opportunity that this type of remotely sensed data provides is the ability to view projects really frequently from afar, and they're able to be viewed by anyone. So it's not necessarily something that lives just within the hands of the project developers or information that needs to be understood by a select few of folks who can really understand the depth of these projects, which can be really complicated. But at a very simple level, this type of satellite imaging that we see that's becoming more and more available, the derived data layers that are coming out of that, really does have the opportunity to provide really accessible information about the types of projects that are being developed, and then how they are changing over time, sort of risk assessments of what's happening on the edges of project boundaries in a way that hopefully will eventually be accessible to anyone who is interested. So I think there's a lot of opportunity coming from the data that is, can't understate how much new data is being generated all the time and how much this field has changed just in the last 6 months or so. But the opportunity that provides in terms of accessibility for more information about these types of projects and more transparency.
Awesome. And Matt?
I think the question of satellite data also needs a little bit of focus on where can you use it in the process to generate a carbon credit. My background has really been used to focus on project origination in the US, more or less what properties will generate the most economic return. And then that information gets bundled into a project design document, that gets a desk review for validation, and then an independent auditor will eventually verify it. I think they have an ISO standard. So I think, that's my basic understanding of the process. We don't get involved with independent MRV or any of that kind of work, but I guess, thinking about it from an operational point of view, maybe one thing to contemplate is an ISO standard that includes remote sensing. Now, I don't know if that exists or not, but normally, as I understand it, it's based on ground data. So, if also these papers were based on remote sensing and not ground data, you would also have to wonder, is even their methodology just another academic article and not actually something that's operational based on what the standard requires? But anyway, that's just based on experience and trying to think about the legal process to create a carbon credit.
That's a really interesting aspect, which connects to the next question I'd like to ask, is this remote sensing versus ground data. So I'm curious if the panelists could share a bit more insights with all of the audience here in terms of how you actually monitor and measure force using remote sensing methodologies, and how does it improve, compared to using traditional methodologies, and where is ground data still needed in this process? I guess I'll start with Caleb.
Yeah, sure. It's not an either or. You need both, right? But with what we're doing at Descartes Labs, we start with Earth observation or remote sensing data, and there's different flavors of that. You can do optical data, you can do synthetic aperture radar, you can do LiDAR. We've chosen LiDAR as our initial approach. The great thing about LiDAR is it penetrates into the canopy, and you get a full characterization of the canopy. Now, that does not tell you biomass, right? You just get a characterization of the canopy. You still have to have on-the-ground measurements to calibrate that against. Our approach is to actually utilize a data set that had some calibration associated with it, that then basically looks at what is going on with different plant functional types, allometric equations, and the return from the LiDAR signal to make that connection. What gets really interesting, though, is then when you get a team of great scientists like we have involved in the mix, and you say, okay, well, the problem with this LiDAR data is it's only in certain spots, and it's only in a certain time frame. But these people that need it over a long time frame, and they need it everywhere. So what are you going to do with that? And our scientists were like, well, interesting problem. We'll figure this out. So they went back and they basically figured out a way to use optical data, which has its inadequacies in some respects when it comes to biomass, and basically train the optical data to identify biomass so that now you have a wall-to-wall estimate that goes back in time according to the record of biomass data, or according to optical data sets like Landsat and Sentinel. So it's an interesting approach. I'm sure others have done similar things, but what's great about it is you get great scientists with good data sets that are using ground truth data to calibrate the remotely sensed data, and then they take that to another level to give you full coverage both in space and time. Now, I will say, it's not all roses, right? It's not all great and beautiful and the data is perfect. There are areas, if you use a data set like that if you did not calibrate against those situations, you're going to have a problem. One I can think of right now is agroforestry systems. Very important type of project that we need to quantify. Did what we utilized, did that characterize the gamut of agroforestry systems? No, it's an area we can improve on. I think we can start good there, but we need to do better. Systems in, say, dry, tropical, arid regions where the biomass is actually more heavily weighted underground than above ground. Have you characterized that well enough such that your remote sensing data sets can handle that? So there's always situations that you can improve upon, but I think it's a great start that the folks here are doing, and also in the industry, taking remote sensing data, on-the-ground data, and advancing it forward to do things that can't be done in isolation of one another.
Brilliant. Matt, would love to hear your perspective as well.
So what we do with remote sensing data, we do the standard kind of remote sensing integration with machine learning. We can train it on LiDAR data, or we'll use LiDAR data directly if we have it for a site. But we don't actually use that information as a final output. We effectively create boundaries of similar stands, forest stands, and then we still drop plots in those forest stands. So we cannot get away from a need to collect forest data on the ground. That's not how our approach works, and it's not what we've experienced in kind of a commercial forestry and inventory in the US. So it is always required, but the question is, how do you do it cost effectively? And also, when do you do it? When it comes to land acquisitions, we have a statewide system per parcel across an entire state where that information can be used to identify valuable parcels on and off market that a client may want to drop plots in and then consider for acquisitions. That's a different use case, and it has a different cost as well. So maybe at a high level, it really depends on the use case and cost of the actual piece of work and need of what someone's going to do with this information.
Awesome. Eve, we'd love to hear a bit about your perspective, when you aggregate all these data, like what can you see and what can it tell?
Yeah, absolutely. And I should have started with the caveat that I am a low-tech person at a high-tech company, so I cannot speak to how this data is created, but can speak to how we've seen our customers using this data within their project pipelines. And there's a couple different ways that I think this data can plug in and provide value. And I'm saying this data, which is a very broad term to mean lots of different types of remotely sensed data that can be applied in lots of different ways. So this is sort of a generalization. But in general, starting in the very early phase of due diligence on projects, having access to remotely sensed data can be really valuable and can save time and trips out in the field. We've seen lots of our customers using this to whittle down large lists of potential project opportunities so they can quickly take a look both at really up-to-date data about what's going on a project site in a given moment, but also look back in time. Many of these data sets look backwards, and so you can look back 10, 15, 20 years and understand the land use context on a site, which in some methodologies is actually required. So for example, with some reforestation methodologies, you need to look back to show this wasn't harvested just so we can plant trees and grow them again. So remotely sensed data can be really valuable for that. And then I also see a lot of value in that long tail of monitoring. So 10, 20, 30 years after a project has been established, how do we efficiently continue to monitor these projects and ensure that they are continuing to derive the benefits that we expect? And remotely sensed data can be super valuable for that, especially as we see more and more projects being developed in fairly remote places where access on the ground can be challenging. Being able to get access to either satellite imagery or a derived data layer that's derived using satellite imagery that's coming out weekly, quarterly, annually, can really be very helpful for getting an understanding of the context on the ground, and also, I think as I mentioned previously, maybe impending risks that are surrounding the project. So are we seeing deforestation starting to impinge in this area, or are we seeing signs of a pest outbreak that we could make a shift in our management strategy in order to address? So really seeing opportunities throughout the pipeline, and certainly in tandem with on-the-ground data collection, as well as replacing some of those visits when possible.
Awesome. Murray, we'd love to hear your perspective as space intelligence as well.
Yeah, sure, thank you. Actually, can I ask a question? Who's currently thinking about how they assess above-ground biomass in a project or in a portfolio of projects? Okay, so a reasonable number of people. So what you'd want to do in one of these cases where you're trying to assess above ground biomass as opposed to land cover and land cover change, because those are two discrete things, is you would go out and systematically measure every tree in the area of land that you're working on. However, typically we're talking about very, very remote environments with very, very large number of trees. I've measured about 5,000 myself personally in Indonesia and Central Africa. It's very, very tough to do. And so what you end up doing is producing samples, these field plots. And if you're following one of the Vera methodologies, for instance, you'll be required to produce a certain number of these in order to satisfy the validation procedures. The way that we will work in the future, and we are working now with groups like Green Gold Forestry, is that we use those field plots which give sparse representations of biomass across the landscape, but relate those measurements to wall-to-wall satellite images. Now, you mentioned optical data and scientific work that you do, so you have a slightly different approach to what we do. Optical satellite data only sees the surface of the canopy. The LiDAR data gives you some structural information. I wrote a paper back in 2015 in Biogeosciences about how you integrate LiDAR data with synthetic aperture radar data. And it's that information which gives you a lot of structural information about the forest, and that's fundamental for biomass. And so there's a question about how you fuse different data sets and create artifact-free blocks of data over your area of interest, which combines the optical information and the synthetic aperture radar information and the LiDAR information. And this is how you start to get very, very accurate assessments of the biomass. And you use those field plots to do the final calibration and validation, i.e. it helps you to understand the uncertainty in your models. And so that's how you have to put all this stuff together. And I suppose one of the refinements to the question is satellite data versus the insight. I would say we're probably drowning in data now for want of information. So you can go to any number of satellite data suppliers and they can provide daily updates, and there's huge amounts of data you can get. But what you're going to be interested in, particularly if you're one of those people who put your hands up, is what's the amount of biomass in my project area to what degree of accuracy. So you want a nice normal distribution of values across the landscape. People often ask about resolution. It's not a question about resolution, it's a question of accuracy. I think it's a very, very interesting discussion now about how we ensure the standards in this market, even of the data providers. And so, yeah, that gives you our view, I think, in a nutshell. I'll stop there, but very, very happy to continue those conversations in the break afterwards.
Yeah, I guess I would like to press the panelists on a follow-up question on accuracy. So imagine I'm a big corporate. I would love to invest in some of these solutions to help understand my portfolio of carbon credits. How accurate are these solutions? Or let's say in a more scientific term, how do you quantify the uncertainty risks in your solutions of measure and monitor force? Moray, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, I can take a quick go at that. So what we would do is produce our final biomass map, so working with either the corporate or the project developer, or indeed the auditor who's taking the project through the process of validation. And we walk them through the models which we've used to create the above ground biomass estimates, and then we compare those estimates with the network of field plots, for instance, in order to be able to give some picture of the accuracy. There are some challenges, I would say, with doing this. They are, for instance, geolocation errors with plots. So if you're walking around in the rainforest, even if you've got a very nice shiny GPS, and I've done this a lot, it can be very, very hard to get a signal. Even some of the highest grade GPS units would have errors associated with them when you're on the ground underneath a rainforest canopy. So if you're trying to relate the position of a particular plot to pixels in satellite imagery, there may actually be geolocation errors, which mean it's quite hard to compare those two. But broadly, and the other way you can do it is also looking at the LiDAR footprint. So these pulses of laser light from space, which give you a picture of the forest canopy height. We can also use those in the validation process. But typically we talk about accuracy in terms of model performance with respect to R² or RMSE. Those are sort of two fairly standard engineering ways to think about accuracy.
Awesome. Matt, we'd love to hear your perspective on IFM methodology and in your experience in the timber industry as well.
So in terms of accuracy, we type out land by using LiDAR and species data. And this is, again, focusing in the US. So we will type it out by density and by height based on LiDAR. And then we have a secondary source from the Forest Service that we add species into. So that's a unique tree species per pixel. We have those maps, and then we create stand polygons. Then our first order of analysis is that we can integrate that information with the US Forest Service FIA data. I think the Forest Service has a $70 million a year budget to collect that type of information. And it's unique. So that's one of the reasons why we work in the US, and we think it's kind of a productizable solution, but that's still not accurate enough. That stuff is normally available like integrated at a county level. Once you then get into kind of enhanced forest inventories, it's still based on stand level analysis, still based on half-meter LiDAR scaled up, and then used to identify or segment the land into similar stands. But at that level, we integrate the data with ground plots. So at a product level, we say we're about 90% accurate with our stands within a 90% confidence interval. And at a enhanced forest inventory level, we say we're about 80% accurate, but within a much tighter confidence of 80%. So that's how we approach and win RFPs kind of in the commercial forestry sphere.
Awesome. Caleb, would love to hear your perspective at Descartes as well.
Yeah, being well, I still am a meteorologist. I'm not a former meteorologist, but my background is in meteorology, and one of the challenges we always had was everybody would say, I need higher resolution, give me a higher spatial resolution. Well, if the model itself is not that good, all you're doing is giving you more bad pixels, right? Great, you have more bad pixels. It looks interesting, but they're not good. So accuracy is very important. I totally agree with what Murray was saying. Our approach is the data set that we use is already constrained by a goal of, I think it was 20% or less relative error to biomass, according to the amount of biomass you're talking about. So that data set already had a constraint on error. We use then training on that data set, which will introduce a little bit more error, then at that point, we had to basically do some cross-validation and hold-out calculations to see, are we doing pretty good compared to their uncertainty estimates? And actually we were. We landed most of the time within the uncertainty estimates of the initial data set we trained off of. We are also working with partners who have forest inventory, and they're taking a look at our data, and we're going to be looking at those results soon, and thus far the direction looks pretty good on that. And I would say this just as an add-on: if we want to see more adoption of digital MRV, I know this is an NDA heavy world, but we have to announce accuracy results freely. I'm not saying share your forest inventory data. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that please allow these folks and others in the industry to talk about the successes in terms of statistics against actual data so that adoption can be accelerated. Because apart from that, if we keep everything behind a firewall, we're just not going to move to where we need to be.
Really awesome insights. Eve?
Well, as a non-data developer, don't have much to speak to on the accuracy side. I will say I think one of the benefits of being able to aggregate a bunch of different types of data, which is what we do at Upstream Tech for our customers, is the ability to toggle back and forth between data sets and kind of compare what we're seeing. So, for example, we have some customers who are able to take a derived carbon layer that they use and actually compare that to what they're seeing in satellite imagery on the ground. So that can provide a helpful check for some of the data questions around accuracy.
Awesome. And another question I guess that the audience would be really interested in is how digital MRV can improve the current process and methodologies. Throughout this two-day conference, I've heard a lot of saying that the current MRV process is pretty cumbersome. And going through the whole process, you probably would create a 200-page PDD document, and every year have 50 to 100-page verification report. And the MRV cost for smaller project developers can be a barrier to scale carbon projects at a larger scale. So I guess we'd love to hear from the panelists. How would you envision these technologies improve the current methodologies from baseline to monitoring, to leakage, to other aspects of the current methodology? I'll start with Caleb.
Yeah, sure. I mean, to the baseline point, geospatial data is very important if you're going to come up with an accurate baseline, because in the end, you should see relationships at the control or the baseline site, spatially speaking, that are consistent with the relationships that you see at the project site. That's a geospatial problem. So right then and there, you go down the road of synthetic controls or baselines that are associated with not just looking at historical deforestation rates, but other factors such as agricultural practices in the area, economic activity. We have this biomass animation that we like to show people, and it's not. I say it's a great animation. It's not great because you see biomass just lost like that, so it's actually a bad story. However, what's interesting about this biomass animation is as you go in time, the losses start out as linear features, okay? And then all of a sudden, everything expands outward from those linear features. Those are roads.
So you have to identify the transportation network, and if you're going to truly do good baselining, you do geospatial relationships against things like that. As far as other aspects of MRV and improving it, I think of Upstream and what you all are doing with your front end. You take data like what we have that's updated frequently, somewhat automated, and then I know this is oversimplified, but hey, it's tax season, TurboTax, right? And so TurboTax generates reports with a lot of data. There are things that I'm sure a front end like Upstream or something like that can take data like we have and put it in a format that the registration or accrediting bodies need in such a way that it makes life easier for the developers. So things like that would be interesting to see.
Eve, we'd love to hear your follow-up as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate the plug, Caleb. But I think that's exactly right. And in my mind, a big piece of the opportunity really is around efficiency. And maybe I sound like a broken record at this point, but being able to replace some on-the-ground work or a large proportion of on-the-ground work with using remotely sensed data can only lead to significant efficiency gains, which is really important for scaling projects in this space. What we hear is that monitoring and that sort of long tail of monitoring that I mentioned can be a significant barrier to undertaking new projects because there is that significant commitment that you're undertaking for a long period of time, whether it be 40 years or 100 years. And so anything that we can do to make the data more available and then on our end to make it more accessible, and as you mentioned, reporting is a huge component. One of the things that we do is we generate the reports as part of our front-end UX. So you select what data you want to use, you aggregate that or annotate that data in the way that makes sense for you, and then you click a button and it generates a standardized report. So all of that translates to dollars and cents in terms of time savings and can lead to more projects in the future.
Matt, we'd love to hear your perspective on methodologies as well.
I guess on methodologies, this is something we were talking about earlier, this group on the side. I think, for the methodologies, those who put together PDDs, it would be great if the standards actually, made the data that's used for the PDDs, made it publicly available as some sort of transparency with this process. I know a lot of companies would not like that, but at least it would then help people that are trying to provide solutions or assist with transparency and assist with these remote sensing methodologies. That type of information could be used for validation of our data as well. So that's my thought.
Awesome. Murray?
Very good question. I would say we're working in a world where there are a lot of legacy systems, which is highly analog, and we're seeing an enormous amount of disruption. So the great promise of digital MRV and technology is that it disrupts all of this. It makes the whole process a lot more efficient, reduces the transaction costs, and improves the speed to delivery, the speed at which you can bring projects to market. I think that's the great hope. That will drive down costs. Technologists such as ourselves are always working on improving the efficiency, the accuracy of products in order to be able to support the process of project development and long-term monitoring, reporting, and verification. One of the other things I think we should talk about is business models. So you talked about the cost being a challenge for project developers. We've moved now to a subscription model, which allows all of our partners to build in the cost of MRV into the operations of their projects. And so it makes it a less lumpy affair for the project developers or the corporate who are investing, and it's better for the technologists because you get repeat revenue streams. So there's all of these things happening, which I think in conjunction will make the overarching system in which we're operating a lot smoother, a lot more efficient, and crucially, a lot more scalable.
Really, really, really interesting. I guess another follow-up question would be, I've heard the panelists mention here a couple times on collaboration and partnership. Obviously, our goal is to drive more adoption of these digital MRV technologies, drive the accuracy, and then drive the transparency of the results. But then this is, as they've described, a heavily NDA'd space, a lot of proprietary commercial technologies, and a lot of for-profit actors. So I'm curious to hear how are you envisioning pre-competitive collaboration in this space, and what type of partnership is urgently needed to advance digital MRV as a field. I'll start with Eve.
Well, I don't know about pre-competitive collaboration, but in terms of what we do, we're an aggregator of data. So we want to work with everyone who has good data available. If you're a data creator and you make interesting stuff, reach out. But we hope to provide access to our customers to as much good data as is possible. And ideally, we want to see the data creators collaborating to do that. So it's sort of simple, but that's sort of the whole purpose of our platform is to allow customers to use some data from one provider, some data from the other, and gain the best possible insights that they can.
Really interesting. Matt, anything to add here?
Again, going back to the point of maybe at a pre-competitive level, someone fund a lot of ground points, again, for transparency and calibration and validation of everyone's data that creates data. That type of system doesn't exist. Again, certain countries have it, like the US does with their FIA data, but getting access to it's not very easy. But if there was something that was publicly available for transparency and for just test accuracy.
Murray, anything to add here?
Loads. First thing is we already work with Upstream Tech on a very exciting project. So they're providing their platform. We operate a platform as well, but in this case, it's a different context, ideal to work with Upstream Tech. So we're already collaborating. Global Surface Intelligence, fantastic company, also based in Scotland, so shout out to the home team. But they're especially focused on the assessment of commercial timber in North America. So where we get a question on commercial timber operations working with TMOs, go and speak to Global Surface Intelligence. They're the specialists. Descartes Labs, we're a little bit closer. Caleb and I are going to go and have a little bit of a fight outdoors, I think. But
It's nice that we're close by.
Yeah, exactly. But I guess first point is we are already working together. Let's all see the big picture in that if we're starting to have like bun fights now over like a fairly small market, we won't grow the entire piece. We won't be able to hit our climate change commitments. So the bits and pieces we're doing now, the relative specialization is going to provide the integrity, the transparency, and the confidence in the market to crowd more private capital into this space, and it will grow the entire system. So I think let's keep the eyes on the prize, which is the growth of this entire sector. I think so. That's my piece. I'll go on again, so I'll leave it there.
Yeah, Caleb?
Yeah, I'm excited about the approaches towards modernizing the process that these folks are talking about, because if they do a good job at that, that paves a better path for us at Descartes Labs, because we're bringing the same technologies to market. We've got some tweaks to it. There's value differentiators for sure, but we're still trying to do a paradigm shift here. And anytime these folks can move the needle on the paradigm in the direction of what we're trying to do, that's a good thing, right? So I'm excited about that. Digital MRV working groups, I believe Vera has one of those. That's a fantastic place where we come together as technologists and figure out, okay, yeah, we're not all doing it exactly the same, but generally speaking, this is an approach we should follow, whether it be dynamic baselining, whether it be more frequent updates to the data, whatever it might be, these working groups coming together, and appreciate Vera organizing such things as well as other governing bodies. That's a good thing, right? So I think there's definitely opportunity to work together in this space.
Really awesome. I guess I would love to go back to where we all began in the Guardian article and all the negative press. Obviously, we've seen an increasing number of public interests in the carbon offset industry in general. However, most of these press, unfortunately, are quite negative. They're not painting a comprehensive picture of what the industry entails. So I guess as a question to all the panelists, obviously you've seen like increasingly amazing results on the ground from all the monitoring, good projects on the ground, good progress made in reversing deforestation. However, like we've seen in this panel really amazing insights, but for the general public, these are a lot of technical elements. Forest plots, LiDAR, synthetic aperture radar. How do you, measure these forests on a technical level? How do you turn that to, positive storytelling? How do you, paint a picture on the ground in what's actually happening using these tools? I guess I'll start with Eve.
Yeah, there's a saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words. And we sometimes joke at Upstream Tech that a GIF that moves back and forth that shows a before and after of a reforestation project has got to be worth 10,000 words. I do think that one of the beautiful things about a lot of the data that's being collected now is it is visual, and so it can tell a story in a way that a table of numbers does not. And we're seeing that a lot of the interest from the customers in our product is driven by not only an interest in generating insights for their own internal decision making, but also how do we tell the story of the projects that we're investing in and share the success with others. And I think remotely sensed data is a huge opportunity for that. Just being able to get access to imagery and derived data layers that are really frequent and really recent allows you to basically have eyes on the ground in places that you'll never have an opportunity to go. So the storytelling piece is a huge component of the opportunity here, and I think we're already seeing that borne out, and we'll just continue to see that grow, both with true color imagery, which is like traditional satellite imagery, and then also with visual layers that are showing things like the growth of carbon over time that you can see happening because the colors are changing on a map.
Caleb?
Yeah, it's good that you said the growth in carbon over time. I mean, we got to change our collateral when it comes to that biomass video that you lose all the carbon. I'm like, oh man, we got to go in the other direction with this, which we will, and that's telling the story, visually speaking, of like, this is a successful event right here. You can actually see the carbon stocks growing over time, looking at this situation. I mean, it really is right now a bit of a PR problem, and in the void, information will fill it, and if we are not filling it with success stories, somebody else will fill it with not so good stories. And so, even going back to the previous question, collaboration amongst those that would be competitive, wouldn't it be awesome if, Murray has a great case that shows, hey, restoration based on our data and on-the-ground events is making progress, and I find a biomass graphic that actually goes in the right direction, and we have a platform together where we talk about, hey, these are two cases where things are going in the right direction with these projects. So I think there's really an opportunity here, and then having tools that are visual is really important, like telling that story. You can't show somebody API documentation, if you even know what that is, and just say, hey, there's great things behind this. Oh, what? AP? Yeah, so the visual piece is very fantastic.
Yeah, Murray, curious to hear the case that Caleb mentioned.
Unfortunately, under NDA, so we'll get there at some point. I mean, a lot of this stuff is commercially sensitive, so fair enough. I would say I've got two points here. The first one being about the positioning of space intelligence. So we will remain as an independent provider of the highest quality data, and we'll disseminate that through our web platform or through partners like Upstream Tech. So people come to us and say, well, why don't you get project finance involved? Why don't you become a project developer? Why don't you develop your own standard? Yeah, there's lots of opportunities, but then we'll develop a conflict of interest and we'll lose our specialization. So we're staying laser focused on that as third-party independent providers of the highest quality data. And I think if people see that as a company, then they'll have trust in our position in the market, because we don't have a dog in another fight other than producing the best data. And then I guess the second part of it is, how do we act as a sector? I think we need to communicate more. We'll take the comms and marketing around what we can do using current technologies and where this is going, and we turn the dial up times 10, and we have to go out and explain at a high level how these latest developments in satellite technology and machine learning can improve their confidence and trust in the market with accurate assessments of what's actually going on the ground. And that'll improve confidence, help corporates and others to crowd private capital into this space and help tackle climate change, biodiversity loss, and help the world's poorest people.
Matt, your thoughts?
There's a cost and benefit to most transactions. We are providing a service. So if we're talking about the community we're providing the service to, when there's a cost and benefit, you guys should be doing your due diligence as well. And if someone is saying their data is perfect, all singing, all dancing, the most accurate thing. I mean, I don't know, for me personally, like there's always a rainy day, and I know that there's an element of sales, but please do your due diligence. And, nothing's perfect, but I think everything is going to be cost dependent.
Awesome. I'm sure there are lots of questions from the audience. So before we open the floor to the audience, can we first give a round of applause to the amazing insights from our panelists? So now we'll open up the floor to the audience. Anyone have any questions for our panelists?
NASA work on mapping wetland ecosystems or habitats, wondering if that fusion of LiDAR and SAR has tackled that problem in coastal environments.
Specifically with the case of mangroves, yes. But otherwise, we've worked less in other types of environments. So mangroves are interesting, particularly with respect to the radar backscatter. So they have that inverted U response to biomass. But we have been able to successfully map those in places like Senegal to assess the above-ground biomass and also changes over time. So if you'd like to discuss that further, yeah, very, very interesting. The integration of the radar and the LiDAR data, of course, gives us the structural information of the mangroves, and the LiDAR data is giving us the crucial information about the height of the trees, which relates to the biomass. Mangroves are unusual because they're accumulating a lot of biomass in the root material and the soils. But yeah, happy to have that chat afterwards.
Anyone else wish to add anything? Let's go on to the next question.
Hi. So we were talking about biodiversity being hyper complex and hyper diverse, and remote sensing works really cool for forest cover, for carbon, etc. But what are your thoughts, I don't know which one of you guys, on what else to monitoring, and I mean, what else to monitor through remote sensing into biodiversity?
Yeah, I can take a start here. Data fusion, which Murray was talking about, I think is going to be really important for biodiversity because remote sensing is only going to tell you so much when you're dealing with that many factors. And what are those factors, right? That we're still trying to figure that out, that we want to measure. We've done a little bit of dabbling into kind of some proof of concepts around, okay, let's look at things like forest fragmentation. You can do remote sensing for that. Get some species data sets, but then again, those species data sets are a bit static. I would say it is very much at the bleeding edge for us right now as far as looking into it and what could be done. But at the same time, you have the tools to at least start getting a glimpse of, yeah, the trajectory is right here when it comes to species diversity is probably better here. Water surface area is increasing maybe where it wasn't. Those types of things, but yeah.
I'm going to jump in and say that forests constitute biodiversity too. So you've got the fungal kingdom, and bacteria, you have plants, you have animals, and of course the plants constitute natural forest, and we can measure those and their changes over time, over space. And so what we think is you could get lost in an argument about what aspects of biodiversity you're going to measure. we're talking about forest for the moment. We can track changes in those forests over time. And so fragmentation is one way you can look at the changes in forests over time. That relates to biodiversity. You can increase your edge effects, increase fire risk if you increase the fragmentation of a landscape. So it's really that change we think we can do very, very well. I think there's a risk when talking about biodiversity. We'll get lost in the detail and say, well, what do you mean by biodiversity whilst it all disappears around us? So that's one thing. Happy to talk about that, the way change data gives you at least a picture about the loss of plants and the fragmentation of the landscape.
Matt?
So when we model species, actually most of our remote sensing, we take an entire year and then we create a stack of information. That stack of information is effectively a phenology or growing season. So we don't just use one day at a time. We use an entire year. We use that information then as our training inputs. So if we're using Sentinel-2 information, we don't have just single bands. We have actually descriptive statistics and coefficients for all of the bands across the entire year. So that is then reflected in practice on how the trees grow, right? And this conversation's targeted on vegetation biodiversity, specifically tree biodiversity. Animals, we don't touch. And then in terms of machine learning, we have a multi-output machine learning model so that when we predict species, we actually quantify percentage basal area for every pixel per species. And we run it through a single model so that coefficients that are effectively multiple species that grow in the same place, the multi-output model actually grabs that cross-correlation. So anyway, in this context, dealing with biodiversity, we use annualized data as our kind of X parameters to deal with the predictive Y parameters, which are effectively the species.
We've got one question here, and then we'll go to the online questions as well.
Okay.
Okay, let's take it back to TurboTax because it's tax season. One of the bottlenecks in the MRV process, at least in my opinion, would be the lack of sort of a cloud computing system to take all of the front-end data, so the data that's coming from SAR, ground penetrating radar, LiDAR, optical satellites, all this sort of source data, and then organizing it in such a fashion where it's easy to use for folks like Vera, Gold Standard, other registries that are interested in this data. That's been pre-certified to some extent, so it's sort of decreases the time and the paper trail associated with many of the data that's required by registries to meet certainty criteria and things like that. So we mentioned a little bit, you mentioned a little bit about it. Can you talk a little bit more about how that's developing, who's developing it, and what might we be able to expect in the next year or so?
Yeah, and there is a bit of a gap with respect to what Descartes Labs provides in terms of this multiple data sources thing and accessibility. Like, for instance, we have a platform that you can get a hold of lots of geospatial data. It's a lot of it has been normalized. It's in data formats that are consistent with one another. It's cleaned, all that type of stuff. But you have to be a Python developer to access it, right? And so that's definitely not the TurboTax model. So I think where it gets interesting is if you have a platform like that, which is bridged to somebody who is able to, again, I keep shining light on Upstream, but front-end developers that are able to pull those data sets from such a consolidated environment and pull the right data sets because they also have a knowledge of what data sets are important, right? The worst thing you can do is just give somebody a bunch of data and say, figure it out. So what you have to do is have somebody who has domain knowledge around that reporting, and they say, okay, I need this subset of data to truly build a solution. So we have lots of data at Descartes Labs. If you want to be a platform or if you want to be somebody who's going to go deep into it, you have to be a developer. But we also have models that deliver it in different ways. But reporting is not really our thing. Data is what we're really good at, model development. Folks that are doing the front end and creating that, I think we need to open that up more to those individuals. And it is open. I mean, they can get in there and do that. So I hope that answers your question.
We have so one of the nice things being based at Edinburgh, they have a wonderful supercomputer, and that helps us keep some costs down, but that's not always the most effective way of doing the processing. So the processing still is on the cloud, but we have our internal process that follows an assembly line. When we work with clients, we have a front end, and we brand our front end with our clients so that they can go and show it to their clients. And that's been one of the ways that we've kind of, we're almost, you could say, an outsourcer for project developers that want the system, the MRV system, but don't want to pay for the cost of the development. So we just brand it in everyone else's name.
How do we go to online questions?
I am the voice of online in the room. You get to enjoy my British accent a little bit more. So Diana asks, as we plan to incorporate remote sensing for carbon and biodiversity in developing design, how do we budget for this? Is it by hectare or which other parameters? And then we're going to do a very quick mic hand to the next speaker so we keep on time, rather.
We work on a per hectare basis, so we price the work on a per hectare basis. There's an initial setup cost for working with us per project site, and then we charge for updates on a subscription basis. So a typical example will be establish the land cover change for the historical baseline situation. We then support the above ground biomass mapping, which helps a project get through a validation process, or indeed that can be used for a large corporate who's screening an investment in a project, and thereafter it's a subscription fee, and you get an update every year typically. If you drop an email to inquiries@space-intelligence.com, my team will be pleased to help.
Yeah, we operate on a subscription service, and then we serve as a marketplace, so you can actually purchase data from providers like Space Intelligence, Planet Labs, Airbus. We work with many of the major commercial satellite companies, and so we are a reseller of data through them.
Yeah, similar. We do on a per hectare subscription basis when it comes to carbon analytics. The idea is you can access it via an API by dropping a polygon and getting the data you need for 20 years of data for a location. Obviously, we're not doing biodiversity yet, and how you value that unit, that's an interesting question that I can't answer right now. So that's how we do it currently. The platform thing that I spoke of earlier, that's a separate product offering more geared towards data scientists. But this carbon analytics piece, if you know how to access or interact with an API, you can get that data.
For us, product is subscription down to exclusivity, if that's needed, and then projects are projects. So it's just kind of like a menu of things that are needed, cost.
Any more questions? Okay. Seeing we are at time.
I thought someone had.
Yeah. I'm sure like audience have more questions to ask. Feel free to approach the panelists after the panel.
After lunch, you mean? After lunch?
Yeah. Okay, thank you, everyone.
We're here all day, so we'll come and answer.
Thank you.